Willkommen zurück, liebe Teilnehmerinnen, nach dieser ersten intensiven Tageshälfte. Welcome back after an intensive first half of the day. We are still very much moved about starting the international festival Latitude today. And we can't say it is working out as yet. Here are a few facts and figures for you. Today, an average of 250 people from many countries worldwide participated. That is a good festival size. The great thing is that people took part who eventually wouldn't have been there in Berlin. That means the participation possibilities have definitely increased. Which countries were represented the most? Germany, Kuala Lumpur, France, England, Nigeria, South Africa, Venezuela, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Egypt, Kenya, Austria, and Switzerland. And in Germany, we proudly present a participation of already 5 federal states. Hello world, thank you so much. We hope that you enjoyed and will enjoy the versatile program as much as we did and will do. For those of you who have just joined us, let me just shortly introduce myself. I'm Prasanna Umman and I'm accompanying you for the next 3 days. And I will just shortly summarize what happened. We heard wonderful greetings and discussed positions on the topic of the day, digital and economic inequalities. We streamed Mulemu Moiloa's and his guests' contribution on alternative possibilities towards self-reliance. Besides, we started streaming the wide variety of artistic productions. For instance, there was Eric Wanke, who describes himself as an accidental poet, which I think is a beautiful description for his creative work between music, words, and performance. Maybe some of you have seen Joanna Tishko's Colonistics, Colonial Gymnastics. What a great title. If not, be sure to come back tomorrow. It's painfully fun. What comes next? Curator Renata Martins talks to one of the residency artists about his work at Villa Sul and Salvador de Bahia. The exhibition can be viewed digitally during the festival as the residency artists were unfortunately not able to work there. Please participate in this with your questions in the public Q&A in the slot on the available social media channels, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Regarding organizational issues, we have also provided an FAQ on the website in German and English. And then there will be also a pre-recorded discussion on the topic of resisting extractivism. That is a tongue twister for me. Moderated by cultural theorist Lotte Arndt. And after that, dear audience, we will see each other again at 7 p.m. Central European Time. Now we will continue with the wonderful Nanjira Sambuli, who will start with a live input and then moderate a live debate on reimagining the internet, also with a Q&A included. I wish you a whole load of inspiration, and I hope that all of us together will be able to support, first, a feeling of solidarity. Second, the strengthening of human relations on a par. And third, the competence of appreciative listening, just as our opening panelists have urged us to do. See you later. Bis später 7.
Thank you, Prasanna. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you may be joining us today. Welcome to this session titled Reimagining the Internet, Roadmaps to Digital Equality. My name is Nanjira Sambuli. It's a pleasure to be back on another session at the Latitude Digital Festival, and I will be moderating this discussion. Now, this session features experts who are non-male and non-Western. For us, we are here to create a new normal. However, I must add that this should not be misconstrued as a purely Global South conversation. The internet and digitalization belong to all of us and are for all of us to shape. So, this is an opportunity to acquaint yourselves with already shared perspectives on digital inequalities and their manifestations. And these experts are just a great subset of many other scholars out there who've been doing this kind of work. And while this pandemic lays bare the state of inequalities, both analog and digital, we will try to, as Renata puts it, decolonize this conversation as much as possible. We want to focus on the wider issue of disparities that are and in how who's accruing benefits in the digital age. And it's important that we maintain this perspective. This issue is not new. This pandemic is merely a catalyst. So, with that, it's my pleasure to welcome the panelists. First, we'll have Renata Ávila, who's a distinguished lawyer and activist. We have Esra'a Al Shafei, who's a human rights activist, and Dr. Mi Yu, who's a curator and lecturer. You will see their distinguished bios on the event page. Please look up their work, it's worth your time. And with that, we'll dive right into our conversation. Renata, let me start with you for a second. Please share with us a hurdle you've come across in your work towards reimagining the internet and digital equality.
The most difficult thing, hi everybody. The most difficult thing that we are facing today, and that is hitting us right in the face, is how colonialism is is the equivalent of racism, but on a nation to nation scale. And as we are confronting this reality for the first time in human history, where we see live stream the actions of colonial power of racism widespread right here with the evidence like hitting us, we have come to the realization that the systems that have been built, communication systems, police systems, the way that we interact with power are colonial in nature, and the internet is not an exception to it. And it is the same way that protests are exploding in the streets, and that we are like somehow powerless, passive witnesses from it from happening. I think that what we are witnessing is that this utopia that was told to us, that the internet was a way to create fast consensus and a way to democratize, is not more than just a remote dream. And what we are seeing today, from the streets of Beirut to the streets of Santiago, from the streets in the US to the streets in India, is this techno-brutalism, this colonialism happening before our eyes, and the urgent need to build the system from scratch. Build the system from scratch is the most urgent present thing, and that's why I'm very happy that we are starting this conversation, because we can put patches in a system as we put patches in the post-colonial state. But the pain and what is broken is so profound that the system cannot, as it is, cannot be fixed. We need to create one new, and not one new on top of what is broken. We need to start fresh. That's my initial reflection. Looking at each and all the layers, from the physical layer to the code layer to the content layer to now the personal layer. We need to rethink all layers to build something new. That's my initial reflection.
Thank you, Renata. And I like that patchwork is insufficient in this moment in time is actually showcasing that. And while we're on that thread, let me turn over to Esra'a, who has spoken and written about this on another perspective, the support we actually get for the institutions, and especially in civil society, and also institutions in civil society in the Global South. Esra'a, you use a fantastic term. You say you are philanthropist, which I actually quite like. Could you speak a bit more towards that and what you see as the hurdle there with reimagining the internet and digital equality in your work?
Yes, thank you very much. I started Philanthropist because I'm absolutely livid at the way Global South organizations are typically treated by private foundations and institutional donors for too many decades. I mean, to put it bluntly, we're talking about exploitation, favoritism, even racism, because currently the cycle works like this. Donors primarily fund global north organizations without questioning their track record and impact. Everything they produce is taken at face value. Meanwhile, global north organizations, specifically those who claim to work internationally, take up the majority of resources and philanthropy. But they won't and they can't exist without us. These organizations rely on us significantly. And by us, I mean, civil society organizations in the global south. They need our data, they need our hard work, they use our platforms, our expertise, our networks, but they never want to sustain it because many of them don't actually want to share their resources. How many US nonprofits, have executives that have six-figure salaries, for example, while the rest of us have to take four completely irrelevant side jobs to sustain our basic operations, to make their work possible? And on top of running our own organizations, we're volunteering our time openly for a lot of these organizations without compensation because we believe in the urgency of our causes. So, how do we build an equitable internet when it is being designed by both creators and funders to be totally unequal? And until, for how much longer do we sit back and watch as it is consistently hijacked, despite our decades-long attempts at leveling the field? So this is really my main concern, is the fact that we can't really talk about equality, sustainability without tackling the root of the problem, and that's a lot of the time the sources of where the money is coming from, who controls it, how it is being mismanaged right now. And the very fact that the people at the top seem to just confirm how the rest of society seems to work in the for-profit sector. So for me, that's really the things that concern me. Global South organizations have nowhere near the resources we need to take on major challenges we experience on a daily basis beyond surveillance. It's literal survival, survival of our operations, of our platforms, of even our actual lives. And these are the challenges that most North American and EU-based organizations cannot even fathom. So what do we do to sustain our work? I mean, honestly, we sell our cars, we sell our furniture, and what we do is despite these financial and resource, dealing with resource scarcity, we still manage to produce the most prolific and relevant projects because of that persistence and commitment.
Thank you. And, despite all that, we're still here, we're still working, we're still putting in the effort. Thank you for that, Esra'a. And I think that the same critique you've offered does expand to other sectors like corporate CSOs, social responsibility actors, and many times we've heard it as well for development cooperation or international development support as well. We'll revisit some of those issues, but first I also want to turn to Dr. Miyu. We're very happy to have you, first and foremost, because in this conversation, even when it's a configuration on Global South or alternatives, oftentimes we found people don't even consider what our colleagues in China are doing. That conversation is so mediated. Please share with us. You've already written so much about this. You've articulated it brilliantly in so much of your work. But just share with us some of the misunderstandings that you'd like to start helping us get about China, starting to get right about China's narrative in tech.
Yeah, thank you, Nanjira. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It is very true that the North and South is very relative. So your South can be my North, and within the same society, you can have the North and South divide in metaphorical senses. So I'll start with the problematic of China. As we're too focused on the West and the rest, China is very much reimagining the internet for us. So last year, there was a consortium from China, mainly headed by Huawei, the company, a few Chinese telecommunication companies, and the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, that proposed a new architecture for the internet called the new IP to the UN. So instead of the TCP IP protocol that we have until now, the new IP relies on state-run internet service providers, which will purportedly boost efficiency for services like self-driving cars, but also raises concern for fine-grained control of the network. So this being the context, what I'll share today is is what it looks like from the inside of China. What are the negotiations or mediations at the level of the state, private entities, and communities also for using the internet for public good? So one thing that's related to internet and freedom in China is, of course, the much contested social credit system. If we flash back to the early days of the pandemic, I question myself, if the social credit system was indeed in place, then why did the Chinese state not use the social credit system to track down people's movements and to understand who has had contact with who and when and where? Interestingly, in the early days of the pandemic, contra popular conception, the Chinese big internet companies, that is the BAT, the Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, they didn't give their data to the government precisely because these companies were already mired in data protection controversies and they fear enraging their users furthermore if they did so. So the only data that the government could make use of in the beginning of the pandemic days was the user geolocation data from state-owned telecommunication companies with a range of 50 meters to 100 meters, so not very accurate. The government, of course, later rolled out a plugin app that the so-called health code that they launched together with Alibaba and Tencent, which of course takes a centralized approach to data. That is, the government is the data fiduciary and the companies are data processors. So for this, there have been various scholars in China that called for setting clear boundaries to the responsibilities for the government as well, because the current private data protection law in China, there is such a thing, sets limits on what data processors can do, but not what the data fiduciaries. So here we can see that this control of information is rather a dynamic negotiation between the state and the private companies rather than a totalizing system in itself. And then, of course, the crucial question for us is how do we augment the role of these other players and how do we bring in the role of the community in there? I think I'll come back to this question in the later round.
Fascinating. I mean, I think many of Renata and others will agree with me. We've probably not read that in the typical mainstream writing about what's happened with China and tech and the pandemic or broader conversations. So thank you for bringing up the fact that we're probably missing out on a whole understanding of what's happening in a very significant part of the world. But we'll come back to a lot of that. I want to now turn gears a little bit to another thematic area for this festival, which is around knowledge production and art. And, just have some reflection, starting with you, Renata, again, on how the internet has essentially not been a boon, if you will, as was anticipated for knowledge production, art, creative sectors, and especially for the global South. And Renata, as a lawyer, and especially with expertise in copyright, you have observed firsthand how some even legal systems are keeping us from, using this platform that was supposed to democratize in help us in producing knowledge and art. So please share with us some of those perspectives.
Yes, the perspective, like lately, before when I started as a very enthusiastic activist, I was very hopeful of collective action and the creativity that could, the Wikipedias and the commons and all these, very naive. But I was in my early 20s, so it's forgivable. And living in Guatemala, to me, it was big world opening, and it was a very exciting moment. And I am very afraid that those who are connecting for the internet for the first time today are missing completely that experience of abundance of knowledge, of opportunities, and abundance of this borderless, limitless, if you had the right tools, even if you didn't understand the languages. I remember how I jumped from link to link, and my connection was very slow. And this flashy internet that we have today that takes me out to my neighborhood is a horrible thing. It's horrendous. The same that we had the possibility to create a new space with new norms, with new ways, and we recreated the physical, all the bad things of the physical world are there. Geolocation brought back borders. Personalization get you stuck in your same circle, in your same neighborhood, with the same services and exposure to the same set of very limited ideas. If you happen to live in the poor parts of the world. You know, like in the and poor. I referred not on poor in the sense, but limited resources. Like, you know, like if the content that you are fed is decided by corporations, it will be low quality. It will be um, the equivalent of what your pocket can afford. Even if you live in the most rich African community with the unimaginable source of art expressions, of music, of culture, you will be fed the young food for your soul and for your mind, produced by pop artists who want to sell young art content for a global platform because of the more structural problems that we are facing, and that's I will divide it in three. First, finance. Pretty much is not as it was that myth of the person in the garage launching a super startup that will give opportunities equally to the global south and north. That this is a myth that it has been dead and buried for a long time. And it is not. Our startups have no opportunities whatsoever in the current system to survive, not even the European ones. Not even the European ones. So this dominance is built on three pillars. One is access to resources, the finance, and the way that venture capitalists finance the big monster, the Silicon Valley, and the emerging monster on the other side. Of the Chinese companies dominating also part of the market. The second is the free trade agreements. Free trade agreements were like the biggest lie of the last 3 decades, promoting countries in Africa and Latin America, and in Asia is a little bit different, but also was very aggressive opportunities of sharing technology and giving us access to markets. It was a lie. What it happened is tying our hands and impeding the innovation and impeding our local industries to access on an equal footing, and having truly participatory systems and building our things, and also developing the public sector infrastructure, digital infrastructure that we need, because one must accept that most of the digital infrastructure, this digital transformation is just benefiting very few companies in the global north. So unless we take that control of the pipes back, I see it very difficult. And the third thing is that we cannot isolate this from the military power, and the internet is a very powerful military asset. Its origin and all we are seeing with the 5G battle. There's a big ambition of military superpower on who controls the sensors, which is the new layer that we will not deal anymore with screens, but with a more complex systems. And we are not moving fast enough to both dismantle this monopoly of power and reoccupying the next generation of technologies. I will talk about it later, but that's in general, that's the system is broken at the multilateral level. It is broken at the infrastructural level, and we are paying the bills.
Thank you for that. As you will be seeing, that this conversation is really trying to complicate the fact that there are very hype-oriented narratives around digital technologies and the internet, and we're here to complicate that, if nothing else, and just showcase and give audience and airtime really to the complications that we see, especially in our work. Esra'a, I want to turn to you and just dig deeper into the conversation about the kinds of support that we see organizations in the South getting. How do you see that impacting, that whimsical meets project-based, project-to-project kind of support impacting knowledge production, creativity, whether it's just in civil society for artists or for other stakeholder groups you've come across?
Yeah, so I mean, our communities often have to grapple with the reality that we have little to no support. Or things like unrestricted funding, there's no flexibility, and programs that get funded aren't allowed to include much in the way of unavoidable program cost. We're told don't put technology, don't, they're discouraging us from taking a creative approach. No support for software development, no support for multimedia content development. It's super restricted. So we end up paying out of pocket to successfully execute projects. I'll give you an example. Projects like MIDI Tunes don't get funded. I founded MIDI Tunes a decade ago, and since then it has become the largest platform of its kind in the MENA region, where independent artists use music as a tool for social justice advocacy. But each month we ask ourselves the same question: how are we going to afford hosting? How can we accommodate our growing number of artists and listeners? It's the same with any platform that is artistic in nature in the global south, and especially one that tackles censorship and surveillance. There are real challenges, but there's no support. In fact, even tech corporations don't support us. As nonprofits, we are still paying full price for most services out there because we're not registered as tax exempt in EU, which has a lot of complications. We were not registered as a 501c3 organization in the US. So we pay hundreds in tax each month alone, despite being a nonprofit, and and really because we don't have the privilege of even qualifying for any of these exemptions. And the system is specifically designed to make us fail because a lot of these types of organizations that don't have these types of resources cannot actually go after these types of legal exemptions and things like that. So you see major nonprofits in the US with income of more than $300 million a year get all kinds of pro bono legal advice. They get all their tech infrastructure at no cost, even though they're the ones who are the most resourced. Meanwhile, the organizations where they have a total annual budget of even 15, 20,000, if they're even lucky, we are paying full price. The majority of that is not coming to us. It's not going to content. It's not going to producing audio and podcast and videos and all of the things that we need to create. All of these things we have to figure out with open source, and whatever is available for us at no cost. We don't have any support when it comes to even covering our basic bandwidth, when it comes to using the internet, when it comes to just basic equipment. All of that is coming out of pocket. So as Renata said, there's no way for us to enter a field already dominated and that is far from accessible. And when we try, it's an exhausting cycle. It's unrealistic, it's unsustainable, and most importantly, it's unjust. Creativity, we see, is often celebrated in the global north, but it is punished in the global south. And by not challenging who controls philanthropy, corporations, monopolizations, we can't survive. And the last thing on this is basically when we see global north organizations be funded, oftentimes the projects are granted for 5 years, 10 years. They have no problem renewing grants. Our grants, we're given on a quarterly basis, and oftentimes we're given impossible metrics. We can't unlock the remaining funding without first meeting 50,000 in traffic for this week or that week. And they impose these types of restrictions on us, knowing fully well that we actually don't have the infrastructural support to even become, to even come close to the kind of numbers they impose on us. But we see our colleagues in the global north and we ask them, how do you meet your metrics? And they say, well, this is the first time we hear of this type of arrangement. Or if they do have that arrangement, then there is, for example, if it's a $500,000 grant, they will already be given 250 just like that. And then maybe 50, depending on a metric, or 10, or yeah. But for us, it's like the entire amount. So it's really, the inequality is just incredibly apparent by just how you ask your colleagues to deal with challenges. And then you realize that your colleagues who are white and in the global north don't deal with those challenges. And so that's the thing that concerns me the most is this type of, what I would honestly just cut to the chase and call it racism, is very prevalent and is preventing us from providing equal amounts of platforms, of content, of projects, of the things that we need to actually take control of our narrative and of our future.
Thank you, Esra'a. And, I think it does bring to mind the fact that, when we're always caught up in the cycle of reacting and calling back and pushing back, our creativity also suffers, essentially. Our art, what we could be able to do, we're always just reacting, and it can be this endless cycle. That said, you have seen in your work as a curator and documenting in amazing ways how artists are trying to leverage the imperfect and equal digital technologies to really start producing some interesting content out there using these technologies. Do share some examples you've come across.
I do also resonate with Renata's reflection on the sort of sentimental old, good old days when there's this abundance of content and all these possibilities. But I also see that what Renata and Esra'a just mentioned as the sort of brokenness of the tech multilateral world also models in the art world as well. So of course, as we've come to see so many virtual exhibitions, video screenings from artists working around the world in the last 2 or 3 months during the pandemic, we see at the same time this sort of preceding patterns or clusters that replicate themselves, right? So centers that have more discursive power tend to get more traction, and it's difficult to reach beyond your own cluster and see more polycentric institutional landscape. So one question I think for us here is how can we foster real polycentric dialogues? Obviously, it's great that we have the Latitude Festival, and we just heard how many countries people are tuning in from how many countries. But then, as so many of such dialogues go, is still mediated by European institutions, and is very difficult to construct multi-directional dialogues from here. So that's one problematic. And another reflection is maybe that will be a little bit more a more constructive one, is that maybe we can take an operational understanding of art. So while we appreciate artworks and artifacts as images or as a durational aesthetic experience, we can also see art in an expanded field and see what kind of social and relational context in which it emerges from and to which it can also act on. So here, especially if we look into the global south, quote unquote global south, it is important, if not more important, that artistic practices are actually situated in communal life and sometimes becoming part of a community organization, be it self-organized debates, social debates, screenings, self-publishing, any number of these. And of course, here Esra'a's reflection on the sort of being punished for creativity in the global south is extremely poignant. So I guess as we claim for decolonizing art in the global north, it's not really about introducing non-West art in an importing or parachuting manner, but how can we fundamentally rethink the institution of art in the society to begin with? So a very small and modest reflection I've made recently as a curator of the next Shanghai Biennale, slotted to open later this year, is that we started the planning of this Biennale basically at the time when each of the wave hit, the pandemic wave hit. First it hit China and then it hit Europe as well. So instead of hastily moving everything online, we thought we would rather take the chance to rethink the ethics of curating. So we're opting to support more local initiatives in Shanghai and elsewhere in China, so that they can do what they do in a locally specific context and making sense for a locally rooted audience. And we could do this over a longer period of time, which is usually not possible with this sort of festive atmosphere of a Biennale. And that, aided or augmented by technology, can also be seen by a larger audience. But the sort of the locally specific core of it is more important for us. So I think in this sense, maybe we can be thinking of art as, in this broader sense, as contributing to a kind of social intelligence.
I like that, art as contributing to social intelligence. I happened to participate in the opening talk, and the role of art did come up. And, you know, freeing art really, I think, is a growing call, not just art for social justice or art for advocacy, but art, let's go back to appreciating what the role of art can be on a more wide scale. And I think that's a great parallel to what we want to see as the reimagining of the internet. So we're going to do a round of questions that have been streaming in, that I've been checking over here on my phone. And I'll try and tie them to the themes we've been having. We have some questions around Web 3.0 and whether we see it as inclusive or mature. And I think the bigger question here, based on even what we're seeing as the status quo of using the internet, pay for play in a sense. Your data or you logging into an account on a platform to have access to the internet. I think I'll reframe some of these questions to just ask, what are we seeing as possibilities and roadmaps for deconstructing that, for going past the, going back to that age when Renata, you talked about, you took us back as a TBT really to what the internet used to be. I've come across great articles as well about what art has lost in the process of going into platforms. So maybe I can invite anyone or everyone to reflect on what we can start doing to either go back to that or build, as you said, Renata, a whole new one beyond the free basics, beyond the current imaginaries that we're seeing in society's tech today. Renata, you want to go first?
Yes,
go for it.
Yes. Sorry, my last name starts with A, so I'm used to go first. Ávila, present here. I think that the first thing that we need to claim urgently is the same way that the postal service, like has been captured and privatized and even taken away from people in many countries. The same, we need to reclaim an interoperable way that is not mediated by the market to communicate each other with the borders in real time. I don't know how it will look like. We still have radio, and radio pretty much works, but it has the politics of a spectrum and it's complicated. So how, the minimum viable technology, interoperable, non-market based, that can connect all of us, that that is not controlled by a central point, but decentralized, and that can be activated at any time by anybody. I mean, it's very basic. It doesn't need to be flashy. It doesn't need to read my emotions better. It has to do the minimum: communicate, and that I don't have to pay, and I don't have to upgrade, and I don't have to go through all this identification process in order to use it.
Yeah. Indeed. And my reflection on it has always been, how can we rethink the whole idea of scale to be what has been sustainable and appropriate for communities, and the interoperability between those technologies as the reference for scale. What I find really interesting when questions like these come up is, and something again that came up in our opening session, is it's somewhat like we should have 10-point plans on how we're going to get there. But I think what we're trying to push here is really reimagine. It's a blank. We're trying to create a blank canvas again, and say that what we can present are ways to think about it, rehabilitating that thought process to build alternatives that we haven't even thought about. So I hope that our audience will appreciate that it's not so much about giving prescriptive answers and responses, so much as it is about even complicating further, so that when we think about this in the recesses of our mind, we're affording ourselves enough to really truly reimagine the internet and the technologies, our art, and everything that we have in society today. Let me bring in another question that either Esra'a, me, you can see if you want to try and tackle. A question is, how realistic is it to develop local, global South-based solutions to bridge the current digital divide? There's some sustainable solutions already in use. Everyone who has either it's an example, an idea of something we're seeing that's fitting that script, please feel free to share.
I will volunteer you for this question.
Maybe I'll synthesize that with the previous question and the Web 3.0 question. I do have a good artistic example to bring into at this moment. It's called Reunion. The website is reunionnetwork.org. It originally started as an artistic or social design project that aims to reunionize people in peer-to-peer care. And what it does is that it is still an application. Instead of quantifying each user as an individual, and then of course develop all these metrics of what you're worth, it takes the basic design unit is actually a interpersonal relationship. So you and a person that you care for will constitute the most basic unit of the design. And over time, this qualitative relationship between you and this person will be tracked in a way that is only legible to yourselves. So through that, it basically promotes peer-to-peer care in a decentralized way. And there's a plan to latch this kind of informal care, or what is until now informal care, into a kind of interoperable system, so that it can also interact with the social welfare system that we have. So that comes from a Chinese designer who is living and working in Europe. And I've been trying to help her also in thinking about how to scale this project. And I guess when we look at proposals like this, we are already blurring the lines, because when we're thinking about organizational models and provision of services, we tend to think in very categorical ways. Either the state has to provide, or it's the private sector giving you very market-type solutions. And then there's the sort of communitarian forms of informal care and all of these forms of organization. But maybe we can, this is where I place a little bit of my hope on for the future, is that maybe in this network society, we can build this triad in a more integrated way and not as separate agents, so that we can co-create services. And on that front, it's been quite interesting to follow local initiatives, again, in China recently, that are exactly exploring this co-creation of services. So you have a local neighborhood where they create a senior canteen, hiring locals who are laid off or who retire quite early. In China, you retire really early. So at 55 you retire, but you're actually still good to go. So there are all these kind of new programs where people start caring for each other. And interestingly, one of these communities in a small Chinese city is developing a community currency to sustain these exchanges. So they come upon this idea completely out of their own practice, instead of in Europe, we've seen in Barcelona and in Amsterdam, there are all these new kind of community currency projects, digital community currency projects being rolled out. And there's tons of books and theories behind all of these practices, but it can also just grow just like that from your own community practice. So, and this kind of goes back to the question of social intelligence and resilience that I mentioned earlier. I think we can really go back to these different scales and think about social network in the original sense of the term social network.
Yeah, a take back. I think reclaiming some of the language will be very important. I know that you wrote about Reunion Network and a bunch of other initiatives in a great article I'll make a plug for on open democracy. I remember the first part of the title is The Missing Third Client.
Yeah, that's it's a reference.
Something like that.
It's a very art historical reference. The missing third client is a term that was proposed by the artist placement group back in the 60s and 70s. This was a kind of an art initiative, an art collective that propagated for sending artists into governmental agencies to work with policymakers or into companies to observe what they do, but also to come up with interesting cross-disciplinary or cross-sectoral projects. So the whole time what they're asking is, what is the missing third client? Because we're not doing this just for art, which will be the one client. And we're not doing this for either the government or the private company, but we're trying to create something that is a third kind. And that is maybe a mandate that we can give to all of us.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much for that. Esra'a, we have a direct question for you, actually. As you passed on the baton, it's back to you. You've been invited to just share a bit more about, the statement that creativity is punished in the global South. And I want to tie that with another question that hopefully you can reflect on whether regional associations or initiatives in the global South can help dismantle the colonialism that still persists on the internet, or what the role of entities like the local Wikimedia chapters could be. So Esra'a, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So what I mean by that mostly is that, for example, when there is an art fund or a foundation that wants to invite more applications, they usually limit that to the global North when it comes to art. So when we see a lot of music foundations or foundations that support the arts, very little of that, unless it's performance arts or research, and even that is extremely difficult to get our hands on. It's designed in such a way to really lower the or increase the barrier of entry to the point where we cannot get any type of support for these things. So we see a lot of independent artists, for example, who are struggling. And we constantly have to be finding new ways to support their work. We see this with also independent filmmakers who have, working on other jobs 15 hours a day and doing something in their free time because, also, again, there's no resources or support for that. We don't see the same type of issues occur when it comes to global North organizations. Sometimes, for example, when it comes to independent music, when we would apply for something, oftentimes we are told you need to find a global North organization to partner with because you're not eligible on your own. So we have to find just any random white person and say, will you put your name on here? And this person has no expertise. They haven't done anything before. But as soon as we put their name there, suddenly we're in the run. But then we have another problem. That person gets inspired, creates their own organization because they have to create some kind of 501c3 or EU-based entity to take the money on our behalf, keeps 80%, and then gives us 20 to actually execute the entirety of the project with that little sum. And they take that money and they spend it on salaries, they spend it on benefits, they spend it on things that we don't have access to. So we're essentially working for free when they're getting paid to basically take credit for our work. And so this is an ongoing cycle that has happened for decades and decades, at least for the past 15 years that we have been doing this. That we have not been able to successfully carve out more spaces for non-white creators. So we need to stop the cycle, of giving opportunities only to those who already have access to those resources and money. And but by that, that's what I meant. They get celebrated if they come up with any type of artistic idea. They're immediately, given the resources to thrive, even not even just from individual donors or private foundation, but even from institutional donors that are backed by a lot of government money. So this is something that I think definitely has to be dismantled at the core. And of course, that's when it comes to the second question, which if you can reiterate one more time.
Yeah, it was just asking about whether regional institutions and networks and associations in the global South can play a part in dismantling the status quo in a sense. And, local Wikipedia chapters were mentioned, and whether your reflections on what you feel their role could be in helping dismantle this.
For me, again,
how it persists on the internet. Sorry about that.
Exactly. And for me, it's again coming to the accessibility of the types of resources. So even when it comes to these types of local efforts, unfortunately, when we go see the resources being shared to certain projects in the global North, it is incomparable, the amounts. And so that is another type of, the inequity that we constantly see repeat itself. So we need to challenge how philanthropy is controlled at the grassroots level. Otherwise, there's no way we can tackle these issues. And I think that's one big role global South organizations can play. And that's one thing that Majal has been doing, is to succeed against all odds, because honestly, I think that tends to piss them off very much. We need to, if we work harder to stop how foundations use their financial resources to whitewash their reputations, the reputations of their founders or even their countries, if we're able to get them to stop treating and thinking about social justice like a weekend project, jumping from one theme to the other based on what's on the front page of the New York Times, giving them the power to decide what is relevant in this world and what is not. Social justice is a lifelong commitment, and many donors fund merely to maintain relevance, not to actually sustain movements. Sometimes we have to wonder if funders do this deliberately because the status quo works for them. I mean, they're at the top, they like to be in control, they like to be in control of the money, they like to be in control of political debate, they like to be in control of public opinion, in control of marginalized communities, maybe even in control of other human beings. So if they were genuinely interested in empowerment, we are here. They are not. They do not show up for us. They put up walls and barriers. So there's no ability for us to enter. But what we can do, and we have to persist on continuing to do, is to be here no matter how many organs we have to sell to afford hosting, the next couple of months. Not that I'm, by the way, I'm not condoning, organ trafficking in this panel, just so.
Of course, but yeah, we're having to bear our hearts, minds, souls, everything, every strand of creativity to just keep ourselves alive. But
I have already offered my kidney on eBay for anybody who wants it. Please, it is yours.
Hopefully we shall dismantle that support system. There's one other round of questions that I'll try and bundle up even as we come towards the end and start getting your parting shots. There's a question about language and how we can decolonize the internet without having to use colonial languages as the basis of communication and creating solidarity with each other. Are there any thoughts anybody has about that? I mean, between the four of us, I think we speak 4 different native tongues. So I'd be curious your thoughts and reflections on that. Renata, you seem ready to go.
No. This time, this is a tough one because I come from a multilingual country, and language is like one of the. I mean, we all know that it's one of the basic things of colonization, and I have happened to be born there. And my country was colonized, and my first language, my mother language, was not the language spoken by the people who built my country, basically, by the indigenous people of my country, but by the language of the colonizer. And that's very heavy because I was living in a place, and the language I was speaking was a language that shaped my perception of that place that didn't correspond to the nature there, the animals there, the power dynamics there, the food that we had, and it is. And similarly, it happens it happens with the internet. The way language shaped the internet and pushed us in a very homogeneous space. It's the same struggle I had in my childhood. It's the same struggle of not having the word to explain something that is happening before my eyes, and in my local context, because our limited language and internet language is not well equipped to deal with the complexities of global culture. And it is yes, we need to reclaim and find different ways to re-explain what we are like as we create a new internet, as we reimagine the new internet. We need to find a space for how the local reception of this new development. And but indigenous people in my country were better equipped than me on the digital transition, because they found many things in their culture to explain this thing that, and even in the prophecies, indigenous prophecies of what was going on, you will find in the Andean region, in the Mayan region, in the Aztecs, and even indigenous people in the US, how they explain using their past and using the past mythology and words, this connectivity among all of us without being in the same place at the same time. So I think looking back at history, and it is not only bringing languages to this polluted place that is the internet today. It's reimagining the new structures, taking language and languages of liberation into consideration. And it's a very confusing answer, and I apologize to those watching, but it is one of the things I feel most passionate about, because a language is a nation with all its histories and legacies, and we are losing it in the real space, and we are not preserving our in the digital. So we need to work on these two things together somehow.
Thank you. No, thank you for complicating that, because I think sometimes we have to dig deeper to the levels and the complexities of it all. Let me add in another perspective or question here, because our time is also coming up. And, you know, me, you, Esra'a, you can reflect on this one. What role could actors like the Goethe-Institut, being one of the major players in the cultural field, play in sustaining our work and in helping the development of greater digital equality? And Kaching is obviously one of them.
Yeah, I was just about to say, open your wallets, not just your minds. So I think that is
just on your terms, right? As you were saying,
exactly. Without the limitations, treat everybody equally. Period. I mean, I know it sounds so obvious, but unfortunately, it is really not. We see foundations all the time claim to be the bearers of, oh, you know, we're here to fight for social justice, for equality, for access to equitable knowledge, you know, for diversity. And then you look at their grantees and it's like white man, white man, white man. So it really is a difficult thing for them to say one thing. A lot of, you know, institutions, and honestly, I'm not sure what the funding model of this institute is like, but I'm speaking just more generically in terms of EU and other places. They do have similar positions. Right now, we're not doing enough. They're not doing enough to level the playing field. They're not doing enough to support creators who don't have the privilege. You know, we don't do enough to celebrate grassroots, local, homegrown organizations. We're constantly still supporting a very imperialistic mindset where other people have to speak on our behalf because they know better, simply because of the color of their skin, because of the language that they speak, because of where they studied, because of also they had access to resources. And we see this, you know, to go very early on when we see what Renata was talking about, what access to VCs and things like that. It's also about who goes to Stanford immediately comes up with it, you know, even though their only other achievement in life is having more than 100 followers on Twitter, immediately millions of dollars they're able to unlock. Why? Because of their social class, and so I think as an institute, it's very important to reconsider who is worthy, and to really understand that even if this is a first-time grantee, they're worth taking a risk on. We have to stop being so risk averse when it comes to these type of works. We can't just keep funding the same organizations over and over again simply because of their already established status. In order for us to challenge the status quo, it means taking new chances, and very few people do that. In fact, oftentimes you're told before you're even eligible to apply for an opportunity or a grant or even to be a part of a panel or anything like that, you have had to have a track record. To have had a track record means you have had to have access to resources and money before. How many people could say that they have done that successfully? Very few. In my situation, I was extremely lucky because the web was actually a lot more affordable to build on 15 and 16 years ago. It was easier for us to create back then. Right now, it's becoming more and more challenging. There are many, many barriers put in and obstacles put in front of us. I will stop here to give Miyu also an opportunity to answer.
Brilliant. Miyu, take us home.
Yeah, I'll do it very briefly. So I think we all need to constantly practice self-critique. We cannot stop at a level where, you know, we feel that we've had enough grantees coming from the global south and that will be okay. We need to keep the learning, self-critiquing all the way until the very fundamental units of our language. And maybe that also brings us back to the language question. There was a moment when in computation, the most basic unit is not just 1 and 0, but the Soviet Union actually proposed a tertiary logic. So it's 1 and 0, and then there's a state called I don't know. And maybe we can end on that level, that third tertiary state of I don't know, as a metaphor for imagining the internet for the future.
That is brilliant. Indeed, yes. 1-0, I don't know. We heard about there's so many reflections actually very resonant with our opening panel as well. You know, the art of listening and truly listening, not just doing it as a performance on these issues. I hope to those who've tuned in, those who will view this later, you see the complexities and that we can peel so many layers to it. If nothing else, may this help you just in your quest to understand this topic better. One, to appreciate that we can't come here and talk about how-tos. There are no guides. It's not tidy. These are not tidy issues that lend themselves to tidy solutions. The same kind of thinking is not going to get us out of this. What I do appreciate about these ladies' work is that they have put out their thoughts intellectually. They've written, they've spoken, they've podcasted. There's so much out there, a lot more to understand where they've been coming and the highlights they've given us here. Please look into it. It's easy to find. They are, even they're very restricted. Google and other algorithms will allow you to find their work, I promise. Do that. Do yourself a favor and use this festival to actually gain more insight into what's already happening and what scholars, especially from the global south, have been saying, artists and others, because it's being put on display, where the question is whether you will tune in. So with that, ladies, gentlemen, boys, girls, others, we thank you so much for the time. Thank you so much, Miyu, Renata, Esra'a, for taking the time, for sharing your labor, your intellect. And I will look forward to hopefully having this conversation. And I hope that we have started to normalize a way for these conversations to go on. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a lovely rest of the day, evening, morning, wherever you are. Ciao.